welcome to this special edition episode of the Adventures in Advising podcast. This episode serves as the podcast version of the panel session that was done at the 2025 NACADA annual conference in Las Vegas titled The State of Advising, an in-depth discussion with past and present NACADA executive directors. This is Matt Markin, and of course, Ryan Scheckel's here. What's up, Ryan?
Hey, Matt. Looking forward to being able to share these points of view. The number of people who've been where they've been and had the opportunity to think through what's going on in academic advising from that perspective is it's really, really valuable to have that kind of access. And so I'm just really pumped to be even a small part of this conversation.
Yeah, and the abstract of this panel, just so listeners know, is that as the NACADA organization draws closer to their 50th year anniversary in 2029, uncertainty in academic advising in the field still looms. So what lessons higher education professionals learned about themselves from their students? What new policies and practices are on the horizon? What does the future of advising hold for the advising profession? What does NACADA, where does NACADA fit into all of this? So we have two parts to this episode. Later on, Cheri Souza from the Stupski Foundation will be back on as a guest host as we interview wonderful. Kyle Ross and Melinda Anderson. But first, we're chatting with Charlie Nutt, retired NACADA Executive Director, to get us started. Charlie, welcome back as always.
So great to see both of you, to be a part of this. I'm really excited to hear you doing these conversations, because I think it's, as we do enter our 50th year, I think for a new person coming into NACADA, they say, well, God, y'all been around 50 years, what have y'all done? And so I think it's a great opportunity for new members, but as well as experienced members of NACADA to just kind of hear how we got where we are and then see how we move forward. Because I think that's the key, as Ryan said just a moment ago. It's really talking about how do we take what we've learned in the past and prepare for what we're going to be dealing with for the next 10 years.
Yeah, for sure. And so, Charlie, let's kind of talk about your experience. So what originally drew you to academic advising and eventually to leadership within NACADA?
I was drawn into it totally because it was my job. I was at a community college as a faculty member teaching English. And at that college, faculty did the advising. And so we did not have any professional advisors at all. We were all required to advise. And so I got hired and went through all the, first day of school with all the administrators and doing all of that. And then the day of registration, my department chair walked in with this folder and said, here are Paul's students from last year. You're going to need to look at these because they're going to be here in 10 minutes to start registering. And that was my total training for academic advising. Luckily, I was kind of a different critter from some of the other faculty members there. I had taught high school for 14 years before I got into the community college area. So I had gone through education courses. I had taught, 10th graders, 9th graders. I had that experience. I had the educational background, whereas many of my colleagues had gone straight into their field and they've gone straight into teaching. And so while they loved their field of biology or psychology or whatever it may be, I'm not always clear that they truly love teaching. And if teaching was not their strong suit, then you can imagine where advising fit into that. And so for most of our faculty, advising was clearly simply registration, getting students registered. And they saw the beginning of the quarter, and then they saw them at the end of the quarter to do the next. And unless the student came in to see them, they made no contact with those advisees unless they happened to have them in class. And so it's a different world for me. I happened to be teaching in what back then was called developmental studies, special programs. So my students really needed a lot more connection to college and connection to each other than the other students did. And so I had an opportunity to build upon that and to work with them. And one of the things I clearly understood after about the first 3 weeks is most of these students had no idea why they were in college. They had no idea where they thought they were going to go with college. They simply came because mama and daddy said you either go to college or you go to work, and they didn't want to go to work. And so they came to college. And so it was really clear that as I talked with those students, that they needed someone to talk about careers, to talk about the future, to talk about how what they did this quarter was going to connect to next quarter. Because we've all been high school students. We all know that once one quarter's over, we assume that's it. We don't ever have to look at that again. And helping a new student understand they've got to build upon this all the way through, particularly if they were going to transfer from our school to a four-year school, how do they make those connections? And so that's kind of how I got involved. It was not I think I'll be an advisor today. It was simply I was how to teach. In fact, one of the first NACADA conferences I went to, when I first got involved with NACADA, someone asked me what I did. And I said, well, I teach English, I advise. And I said, well, what do you do? They said, well, I'm an advisor. And I said, well, that's great. What else do you do? And they went, I'm an advisor. And I went, well, but you must teach. That was the first time I understood there was even something called an advisor, because I just assumed everybody had been advised by faculty members, and we must all be faculty members. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn from those advisors who this is what they did full time, and how I could learn from them and working with my students every day. So from a perspective of being a better advisor or learning what it was, NACADA was simply how I learned. And that was my training. That's why I got involved with it. And so I look back, I've been around about 50 years, I guess. When I look back at the very beginning, NACADA truly was my professional development, my training, my connections, learning to meet people like you two, but as well as all the other folks I knew across the world, and learn from each other. It was just a great experience for me as a faculty member advising.
So, you transitioned from K-12 education, and then you were in the two-year institution setting, moved into administration at your institution. Tell us a little bit about that move and what that was like from your role as a faculty member and advisor, and in moving into an administrative role, specifically with that advising sort of perspective in your toolkit.
Well, I was lucky, Ryan, because I was able to convince the president at the college that at that point, after I'd gone through 5-6 years of NACADA and getting to know the great Nancy King and learning from her, that we really needed a better words, an advising center to work with those undecided students who did not know why they were there. So part of my administrative role was to open up an advising center for all students who were either undeclared, they were in academic warning, they were on probation, they were coming back after suspension, to work particularly with those students. So my role was to open up this advising center to convince faculty members who were already teaching and advising to give me 3 or 4 hours a week to work in the center with this new set of advisors. So that was kind of my job. When I got made vice president for student development services, the key was open an advisement center and provide training. The other piece was that was my responsibility to provide training to all the faculty. And I always try not to be negative, so I'll try to be positive. Once a faculty member has been advising for 10 years in their job, they think they know it all. is that they don't need to go to training anymore. They don't need to have professional development. So making those professional development activities for them be something they saw a need to come to and a way to keep learning about advising.
So, Charlie, when we think of your time in NACADA, especially as executive director, I'm sure you've learned a lot of lessons leading an organization. If you could go back and give yourself any advice as you started your tenure as executive director in NACADA, what would it be?
I think I understood the connection to the members. I think I understood building a membership where in my opinion, one of the primary goals of NACADA is to connect advisors to each other and to build a professional experience around the field of advising. Probably what I needed to learn, and I learned after a while, is how to deal with boards of directors, because that was a whole different world for me within that. And so I think that was where I needed to work the most, and I did a lot of work in that area. Having been on the board, having been a president of the board at one time, it's a different. You're a different side of the table when you're the person who's bringing all the information for the board to discuss, and then, quite frankly, to learn when to shut up. Because I needed to bring information to the board, have them discuss it, and learn that my role was not to be making decisions. And to be a part of that, my role was to be sure that the executive office and the executive office staff fulfilled the board's directions, the various committees, the various advisory boards, that we were responsible for making sure that the members, where the members wanted us to go, we followed that path. And so I think that was where I needed to work the most. And I learned to do that. After a while, I got pretty good at it, but that was probably where I needed to have the most training in the association piece, was working with members and being sure that members understood, yes, we know you have full-time jobs. We know you have a full-time job on your campus. We're not asking you to implement all of these wonderful new programs that you want the association to do. That's our job to do. And to be a part of that communication at the board table, at the council table, and to learn to keep my mouth shut and listen to what they said, because it wasn't my job to tell them what to do.
So looking back, do any moments stand out to you as turning points for NACADA as an association? From your time as executive director and the many things that changed and happened during those times?
I think one of the biggest things, and it's kind of in the list of questions y'all sent me that and Ryan, you and Matt know it better than anyone, is the whole focus on technology and how technology has changed the field. Technology has changed higher education within that. I think that's a really big piece that the association had to get a handle on, and then the executive office needed to get a handle on, particularly as we went through the pandemic years. I mean, one of my biggest concerns was we learned so much because of being thrown into the pandemic that we had to do differently, and we had to do in new ways. Now, I was afraid once we got through the pandemic, we were just going to go back to how we always did things and not use what we had learned during that online piece we were doing to do activities and to make connections. And so technology was a really big piece. The other piece, for me, as one of my goals as the executive director, and I was very, very, very lucky to have come in at the same time as the wonderful Marcia Miller, was to expand our publications and our professional development material. Because when Marcia and I came to the executive office, we had one book that basically Nancy King had done as the editor. She and Wes Hadley had made that happen. We had the newsletter, we had the journal. And so one of our goals was to begin to work on our monograph series, to expand the newsletter beyond just information about the association, but also information about what's happening on campuses and encouraging people to write. I was really, really touched and kind of excited yesterday. I think you both know Patrick Kate, and Patrick has gone on to be a president now, and he's doing wonderful things. But he happened to get an email yesterday, and you may have seen it on Facebook, from when he first wrote an article, and Marcia Miller had to force him to do it. And he said, Marcia, how about if we write something now about what do you do after you get out of advising? Let's do it. So it's really cool to hear Patrick go back to, in his mind, how wonderful that experience was, and to kind of put it out there to Marcia, let's write something new. I want to write again. And so that was it was touching to hear Patrick say that, but that was something we really wanted to do. And luckily, Marcia and Lee Cunningham were just amazing in getting people to write, to helping them write that process, bringing in the whole webinar process, which was all new worlds to us, and how we did that. And Lee Cunningham did a phenomenal job with those aspects, providing, I think, much more connections and support for the regions. When I first came in, Diane Madison was there, and Diane was amazing with helping regions plan their conference. But as far as helping regions continue to grow and expand, we needed to work on those pieces. And so we worked on those aspects. I'm really excited now to say we no longer have 49 CIGs or whatever those used to be called. And now, we don't open a new CIG every time somebody has a new idea. I think that's a great turn that Kyle has made within that. But, providing that support, because everybody, once you get someone involved in NACADA, it's awesome. But what you do, that's also the point that they want you to do everything that they ever thought about doing. And you have to be able to learn when to say no. And you have to be able to learn when to say, well, that's a great idea. How about putting together the plan for how you would like us to do? And then that person can then decide how important it really is to them. It's one thing to say, I want it done. It's another thing to say, that's fantastic. Bring us a plan back. And so helping work with those, I think, was important. Helping leaders to be better leaders. We did not do any type of professional development for our leadership. People came onto the board. They really didn't know what that meant to be a board member. They didn't understand that didn't mean they were running the association. That meant that they were designing as a board where we needed to go. I lived through the days, and you two are too young to remember it, but when we used to have 75-member boards, every single person who had a job for NACADA was on the board. And so when we would have board meetings, there'd be 75 people in the room. And, the vice presidents and the presidents would leave the meetings, but, we were sitting there as a region chair. I came in as a region 4 chair 2 years in the association. And all of a sudden I was there making decisions about the future of the association. And Joanne Huber, who you all know, is a very good friend of mine. And Joanne and I came in at the same time, and we kind of sat in the back of the room and just went like, okay, who's that? And why are they talking? And what do we need to do? And so I think we're doing a much better job with providing professional development to leaders where they are. What a region chair needs to know is very different than what a CIG chair may need to know, than what a council member needs to know, from what a board member needs to know. And I know that we're doing a much better job providing that professional development. And I know Kyle is really focused on that and moving that forward.
Oh, my anxiety would be through the roof if I had to sit in a meeting with 75 people in there.
It was scary. Let me tell you, it was scary.
So, we know the changes have happened, and let's say just generally in higher ed, it's a different climate than it was years ago. What advice would you give maybe today's academic advisors or higher ed professionals who are entering the profession in advising?
I'm laughing at how Matt so tactfully said that years ago, Charlie. I know. I think the very first thing I would say to any brand new advisor is get involved with NACADA. I think that ought to be a requirement of new advisors. I'm a firm believer in, and I worked with lots of presidents and chancellors and provosts over the years to get them to understand the value of NACADA, and that paying that membership fee for new members is the way you get them in and get them to see a part of that. I was not successful with many of those, but I got a few to make some changes within those pieces. Within that, I always tell the story. I was one of the first conferences I spoke at. And I don't even remember where it was. And I got up and gave my speech on student success and the connection of advising to student success and the institutional role in that. And I sat back down beside the provost of that campus. And he said, "You really need to do, and we need to do a better job of that here." And before I caught myself, I said, "Well, you're the provost. Can't you make that happen?" And he looked at me and said, "I can say a lot of things, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen." And that was kind of a click for me to recognize, even a provost can believe in this professional development and believe in that connection, but if they don't find ways to get new advisors to understand that, becomes a big piece within those. I think one of the things I've always had a concern about is, and you'll probably hopefully pass this now in your role, but this year you 5 get to go to the conference. And so that the other 10 don't get to go. So that means those other 10 don't see any reason to connect with NACADA because they didn't get to go to the conference. And getting members of the association to understand, it doesn't matter whether you attend the conference, you're still going to learn from the association. You're still going to get that professional development from the association. Attending the conference isn't the only way that you achieve that. And making that connection, I think, important as we move forward.
Yeah, part of me imagines a brand new faculty member stepping into their position, thinking about the tenure and promotion process, and somebody saying, "You don't really have to engage with your discipline, the scholarship of your field. It's really not about that. It's just making sure that it's the semester credit hours." But that's another conversation.
That isn't ever going to happen, unfortunately.
Right.
I like I said, when I went to my first campus, I spent every day, first 3 days talking about the campus and our program and what I was teaching and how we connected and all of those pieces. And then my dean walked in and put folders on my desk at 7:30 and said, "Oh, all these people are going to show up in a few minutes. You'll need to advise them."
Right.
And I thought, what the hell is that? And they well, just get them scheduled. And I thought, well, I think advising is more than scheduling. But they didn't realize that. And so even helping my colleagues on my own campus that I knew very closely, I happened to go back to teach at the college that I had gone to as an undergraduate. And so all the faculty knew me as Charlie, and I still knew them as Dr. Keith Earl and Dr. Strickland and Dr. And so when I would say to them, well, we need to do some professional development, they would kind of look at me like, oh, yeah, it's Charlie. So just working within that was important. And I think as an executive director, helping our leaders to understand how to go back to their campuses and provide that professional development, because they got to go to the conference so that other people would see a need to go within that. And I think that's something we still need to work on. A lot of us go to conferences, and when we get back, no one ever asked us what we learned. We're not really given a chance to give any type of report or something back to our colleagues about what we learned. And I think that's something we've got to continue to work on.
And speaking of things to work on, as we wrap up, I'm wondering, how do you think the foundation you and your colleagues built has positioned NACADA for where it is today, approaching its 50th anniversary? And what role do you hope NACADA plays in higher education as we move toward 2030 and beyond?
I think there's 3 areas that I'll focus on, and I'll do it quickly. Ryan was so tactful. He said, as we move through this, it's time to shut up, Charlie. Within that. But I think that the whole key is how do we continue to connect with technology, because that's not going away. And how do we train advisors, and particularly faculty, who they've got so many other things happening that they don't understand that connection. The role professional development plays, and how we can continue to provide professional development to all NACADA members, whether they go to a conference or not, I think is key. Because we all know you pay your membership when you go to the conference. That's part of how we've done that very carefully to make that an easy thing for our members. But if you don't go that year, you don't pay, then you're not going to have those connections. How do we keep that connection moving forward within that? And then I'm just going to be real frank, Ryan. One of the things I worked really hard on was to build a membership that connected with each other. To go out to campuses, to make those connections. And Kyle is amazing at that. And I just continue to encourage Kyle to make that connection, to build us closer together. Student success is always going to be an issue. And what we have to do is be sure when those conversations are had on campus, that academic advising is at that table. And it doesn't have to be any of us, it could be someone else, but advising has to be at the table when we talk about the success of our students, whether it be first year, second year, third year, fourth year, whenever those conversations are held, academic advising has to be at the table. If not, then advising is never going to be seen as a key part of the success of our students in their programs.
Very well said. And Charlie, it's always great having you on the podcast to share your knowledge and your experience for listeners. Thank you so much for being on again.
Always. It's great to see both of you, as always, and I hope to see you again soon.
I am joined by returning guest of the pod, Dr. Cheri Souza from the Stupski Foundation. Cheri, welcome back.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to be back and to be talking with Melinda and Kyle and possibly Charlie. They have such great experiences spanning so many years. And so it'll be really exciting to kind of hear where we go, what's next for 2029 and 2030.
Absolutely. So let's bring on our guests and let's find out these maybe answers to these questions. So we have Dr. Melinda Anderson, a previous executive director of NACADA and now at Achieving the Dream, and also Dr. Kyle Ross, the current NACADA executive director. So Kyle, Melinda, welcome.
Thanks
for having us.
Thank
Glad to
you
be
for
here.
having us.
Yeah, Cheri and I are going to throw some probably very tough questions to you all, and we know you'll have some answers, hopefully, for us. And maybe we'll start out easy. And Kyle, we'll start with you, just to kind of give us a foundation, a little bit of a history of NACADA and its impact. Can you give us a quick retrospective of how NACADA has shaped advising globally? Whether you want to throw in any its accomplishments, milestones, anything you want to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an exciting time recognizing that we're coming up on 50 years in 2029 for NACADA's existence. So it was formally chartered in 1979. The first annual conference took place a little bit beforehand, though, in 1977. So we've got quite a bit to celebrate coming up in the next few years with our 50th anniversary of the annual conference and then the 50th anniversary of the establishment of NACADA as an association. And it has come a humongous way as an association. And when we think about 50 years, most people think that's a long time. But when you compare yourself to other higher ed associations, they're actually fairly young. Many of the higher ed associations that are kind of really big and broad out there in the universe right now, like NASPA, ACRO, that a lot of people know those acronyms, those are 100 plus years in the making. So looking at us going in 50 years from a handful of people that wanted to see this organization get established to 14,000 members where we're currently at, spread across 40 countries, is huge. And I think that that's due to just the sheer passion that people have for academic advising as a profession, for engaging in this community that we offer for people. And so that was the huge just turning point right there is 1979. Advising has been around for hundreds of years in different ways, shape, and form over time. And that's well documented in the literature. But once it was established in 1979 that we have this dedicated advising association, the rapid evolution of academic advising as a profession has just skyrocketed since then, since the establishment of the NACADA Journal as a peer-reviewed source for research on academic advising, for establishing different things like the pillars of academic advising, where we have the concept, the core values, the core competencies, our conditions of excellence, the CAS standards, and what will soon be an established formal definition and scope of practice for academic advising. I'm really excited for where advising is now and where it will be. And the things that people are now asking isn't about, is advising important to an institution? It's how can we maximize the potential that advising has in driving student success? And that's a great gear shift as well, and the questions that folks are asking us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a panel with the both of you as past and current NACADA executive directors. So I think the other question to maybe ask before I turn it over to Cheri is, what does an executive director do?
I saw how
that's a great question.
Yeah, Kyle quickly muted himself, and then you were like, "So what do you do, Kyle? What do you?"
No, it's a great question. So the executive office runs the whole operation of the association. And, you need an executive office to manage the day-to-day operations that, while we rely on volunteers heavily, they have their own full-time jobs, right? So they don't have the capability to plan a 3,500 person conference day in and day out while they're also advising 300 to 500 students, right? So you have an executive office to sustain the day-to-day operations, and the executive director is responsible for making sure all that is running as smoothly as possible while also being externally facing. So engaging with other associations to make sure our brand is out there in the universe and as widespread as possible, to seek funding and different research collaborations, different opportunities for us to be present in other communities where we would normally not be. So I've been traveling quite a lot over the past couple of years and to different conferences in different places and spaces where people are just grateful that we're there and can talk to administrators and leaders around academic advising. And they may not always be as knowledgeable about it as they'd like to be.
Yeah, and I know I've seen a lot of your LinkedIn posts and the traveling, having the conferences and presenting, and just among just a little bit of those responsibilities that you have among everything else. So I hope you're also having your wellness and taking care of yourself too.
Absolutely. Yeah, this year's been interesting for sure. But yes, I love the job, so that's really fulfilling. And I don't ever see myself looking back on the decision I made. It was the best decision I made, the easiest decision I made, and I'm incredibly happy. And it helps when you have wonderful people who went before you, paving the way for a very smooth road. So thank you, Melinda.
We're so lucky to have you, Kyle, and would love to, kind of transition and shift into the theme of institutional change and benchmarking. I'm excited. We have so many decades of leadership, amongst the two of you, and I'm sure you've collectively really seen advising evolve through different eras and challenges. And I'm hoping that you folks can share some innovative ideas and approaches that have stood out to you over the years. I'm curious, from your vantage point, what innovative advising practices have you seen emerge that, are out there continuing to support equity, access, student success, and, the gamut of everything that advisors take care of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the things that have really evolved in recent times is how to efficiently manage relationships with students, because you need that relationship that matters to the academic advising conversation. First and foremost, a student often has 1 to 5 points of connection to an institution, and advising is always a consistent connecting point. And sometimes we are the only connecting point where a student feels like they know someone at the institution who is caring about their success and their well-being. But the realities that we're facing right now with funding constraints, limitations around policies, and the enrollment cliff have made it so that people have had to look at, well, we can't always have the luxury of every student having an advisor who's available for them within seconds, who knows them in and out, and has hours of time available to meet with them. So they're now looking at, okay, well, how do we make that efficient, but still preserve the relationship? And that's where we've seen some innovation come along with using data-informed advising practices to know who we need to be reaching out to more intentionally, thoughtfully, differently. I mean, even note-taking systems in the last 10 or 15 years have really allowed for people to actually remember the students they're talking to, without having to dig through hundreds of files in a cabinet in their office and trying to find that again. So that's all of that efficiency making. And so I think that those are some of the innovations we've seen. I think there's some really cool opportunities for AI to complement advising, but not replace it. So that is the soapbox I'll probably talk about a couple times, is that I know that institutions are looking for making efficiencies with personnel. And while AI is a great tool and a great complement, it cannot replace it. So when people start talking about AI advisors, like, that may not exist the way you think it can or will. Yeah. But Melinda, what else do you see in the universe around innovative practices?
I agree with you, Kyle. When I hear chatbots, I'm always like, tell me more about that. That sounds very interesting. I think about, for example, why we need NACADA. Right. And I think that, Kyle, you've hit the nail on the head in a couple of areas, because when we think about how we preserve the relationships, I automatically think about what systems are we building or keeping in place in our respective campuses. Because when you mentioned the idea of the file cabinet, I think about my advisor in college, and they definitely had a file cabinet where they went to, where they brought out the vanilla fold. I'm telling on myself. I started when I was 12. That's how old I am. And so when they opened up that file cabinet and they pulled out that vanilla folder with my name on it, right? Like, that was their organizational system. And when we think about case management approaches, and we think about what technologies that are in place that are helping advisors do their good work, it's not replacing the relationship. And so when we hear about AI, especially post-pandemic, in terms of what's helping to support case management approaches, I always remind people that the tail should not be wagging the dog, right? How do you do your best work, and what technologies support you? But I think about the shifting environments that we are finding ourselves in. We know that the value of education has not gone away, but we know that we need to be doing something differently. And so when I'm having conversations with campus leaders, or we're seeing the policy changes, right, I always tell people, like, don't get caught up in the news cycle. What does this mean, and how does this impact me, and what's going to happen to my campus? We always have to go back to being student-centered. What do your students need right now? What do you need right now to be able to do your best work? And that's how we remain centered in terms of best practices. And so when I think about all the traveling you're doing and all the conferences you're having, those are the conversations that keep us centered in our work. what is it that you need right now in order to maintain our best practices? And so when I think about how advising has grown, the professionalization of advising, for those who have been, and I'm going to tell my age again, right, getting our master's degrees, and we're hearing about student development theory, Chickering, FYI, and we're thinking about how students develop along this continuum. We know that these theories have changed in the way that we think about the students that we're currently serving. And so what are those best practices that we need to be putting in place right now on our campuses to support the students that we're currently serving? And when I think about adult learners, especially when I think about my current body of work around community colleges, that is the type of theories that we need to be thinking about to serve students. So Kyle, I agree with you when we think about how do we become efficient with our models to serve our students the best way we can. They have different needs. And so what work for us as students aren't going to work for the students that we're currently serving that are on our campuses in a virtual setting and in person.
Thanks, Melinda. I think those relationships are so important. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to head to the national or the annual conference is to kind of hear those best practices, throughout the conference. I'm curious, question for both of you. How do you define and measure success for advising in today's rapidly changing higher education landscape? I know you kind of mentioned a couple of things, but I'm curious, what does success look like? I would imagine there's a tension between traditional metrics such as retention and graduation with the more nuanced indicators that you were talking about, Melinda.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely, I will start with the data and then, because when we say success, I'm student-centered. So I am old school in that when I think success, how is a student defining success for them? And when I think about the concept of community vibrancy and how a community defines success for itself. In my current portfolio area, we think about, rural community colleges, we think about tribal colleges and universities. How do those communities define success for themselves? When students come to school, they think to themselves, I want to be successful, I want to be employed, I want to be able to take care of my families. And so when institutions define success for themselves, are they thinking about their accreditation standards, right? When faculty think about success for themselves, are they thinking about how am I teaching my students to learn these concepts in their classroom? But Cheri, that's not what you asked me. You asked me how I'm thinking about student success metrics. And I have to also talk about the realities of retention, persistence, and completion. But also I have to be honest about students. We do not graduate students who not, right, have sustained, to graduate into a position or have a job, right, with high earning wages, right? My angel baby, I always often talked about my daughter who is a transfer student twice, right? She left one 4-year institution to go to a 2-year institution, and now she's back at a 4-year institution. And watching her journey is been very interesting. And she says to me, I want to go to graduate school. And I'm like, you should do that. But then her fear is, will I get a job? Will I be able to buy a house one day? Will I be able to take care of myself? And so these are the realities of our students. People want to get a degree, but they also want to be employed. They want to be able to take care of themselves. And so those are also the realities that we need to be thinking about. What do those outcomes look like when our students are graduating from our institutions? We can't just stop at, do they have the degree? And so when we think about those employable outcomes of our students, we know that is what the measurement has now moved to in terms of is an institution doing well. So when we think about and I'm not going to just say career advising, I'm talking about the lifespan, right? When we think about even community colleges and people are coming back to retool and to get a different skill set, are we developing on and off ramps for people to come in at certain times? Like, I'm going to come in and get this credential, and I'm going to come back and get another credential. So they look at themselves as lifelong learners. So when I think about the idea of defining success, I always do start with, what is the student coming to school in order to be able to achieve? How are we as an institution designed to be student ready, to be able to help that student accelerate and to do well? How are we looking at the financial implications of a student when they're coming to school in order to be able to meet their goals? But then I'm also thinking from a practitioner standpoint, how am I learning and becoming stronger in these areas to be able to design these systems to make sure that these things are happening? we have to continue to think differently about the work that we're doing so we continue to get stronger as practitioners, as leaders, as administrators. So I feel like I can't always think about one side without the other.
I think for me too, there's some metrics around belongingness that some research has started to come out on, and like how do we validate the students' experiences on campus in their overall situation in higher education, and really making meaning of those experiences in terms of navigating complex structures, what skills can be transferable to the career world as a result, or integrating things like their understanding of why their general education curriculum is structured the way that it is versus their major, and understanding what they're supposed to get out of the entire bachelor's degree or associate's degree or whatever credential that they're pursuing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're starting to see some research drill down into those smaller variables as well. Like when we think about persistence, instead of just looking at it as an umbrella term, now we're looking at the likelihood of them stopping out and coming back, the rates of attempting a certain amount of credits versus completion of a certain amount of credits, and then the frequency that they're engaging with an advisor to determine if that's predictive of all of those different metrics that kind of fall into that umbrella of retention, persistence, and completion. Mm-hmm. But then, like Melinda said, I also agree that there needs to be more research into what does that mean for the getting out into the world after graduation. I know that people debate what is the purpose of higher education. Is it to enrich a person's mind, to develop them as a person, or to get them access to the career workforce? And I say all of the above. Mm-hmm. And especially with the rising costs of college, it's something that you have to anchor yourself into as career success as well, because when some students are walking away with 6 figures in debt, if there's not something available to them to live their lives and pay off debt, the institution has failed them in that point in time too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We can't make these promises and not be planning for their future on the other side. I agree. Here.
Now you both have mentioned certain terminology, so like enrollment cliff, retention, persistence. And this could be a great segue to maybe kind of unpack more of that in terms of how advising is connected to that. So I'd love to hear from both of you. Melinda, maybe we'll start with you, and then Kyle after. Some people may listen to like, these are just buzzwords. I'm hearing enrollment, retention, student success. Mm-hmm. We're hearing more and more about another enrollment cliff. Mm-hmm. And sometimes advising gets lumped in as, advising is retention. Or sometimes I'll hear from others that say like, when something goes great at our institution, advising isn't mentioned, but if something doesn't go as well, then it's like, let's blame academic advising. How do you help unpack all of that?
Oh my gosh, Matt, Cheri, Kyle, you're absolutely right. I remember it was like, those concepts. So I've done some research because I love these questions, and I was just like, Matt and Cheri. So I love these questions that you sent us. So I did write some numbers down, because when I think about like this enrollment cliff, you're right, it becomes these buzzwords that people just kind of throw around. So the 2017 census predicted, right, that 18-year-old population would rebound. But then they came back and said by 2033, that actually it would decline by 3.8 million by 2039. So what does this implication really mean? So after 2039, this population of college-going age group, right, will never exceed 4 million ever again in this country. So when you think about what that means from a business model perspective, you will only have a certain number of people at a certain number of age group for traditional age going, right, that will ever be a certain age. And so what that means is that if the higher education value, right, the trend of going to college still increases, the pipeline will narrow because there's only so many in terms of birth rates. That's essentially what we mean by the cliff. So if this pipeline is shrinking of traditional age, you're going to increase competition, right, amongst four-year institutions for saying, okay, you're graduating from high school, you should come to this college. And so I was talking to my friend who's a VP of enrollment management. I was like, so how do you feel about this? He said, I'm scared, right? Like, imagine that you're now, the competition that was already out there, and now it's going to get even fiercer. So I always used to joke when I was doing enrollment management work, it was kind of like an amenities war, right? The person who had the Chick-fil-A now is like, you need a swimming pool. And now instead of a swimming pool, you need to have valet parking, right? Like whatever you need to do on your campus in order to attract that student, it's going to increase. But when you think about from an adult learner perspective, there's 100 million adults with some credential and no degree right now. And by 2030, 70% of jobs will require some post-secondary training or education. So the pipeline of traditional age students is narrowing, but adult learners is increasing. So what does that mean for the implications of, advising, right? So thank you, Matt. That's a really good question. What does this mean about us? The way that we support students is always going to be different based on who it is that you're serving, right? So where do adult learners go, right, versus where traditional age students go? And so the differentiation in terms of the students that we're supporting, they're going to need different things. So when we think about if the value of higher education is always going to be there because it's tied to employability, like I need a degree or a credential in order to have a higher wage, in order to be able to achieve different type of personal professional benefits. Adult learners are going to have different needs in terms of work, right? They may be working full time. They might be taking care of families or taking care of aging parents. Amen to those who are listening, who are in the sandwich generation. That is me, reskilling, career changes, right? There's going to be different enrollment strategies, right, for that adult learner versus that traditional age student. The traditional age student is also going to come with parents. Amen. I was in that space, right? Because you're not just talking to the student, you're also talking to the parent. And so you have implications for advising based on who you're serving. You're always going to be addressing the financial dynamic, right, of the cost of that degree. And that's regardless if you're serving a traditional age student or an adult learner. So time to degree is always going to be important, right? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take me to get through? When you think about other strategies like dual enrollment for traditional age students, they're going to be coming in with some credits already. So you're going to have less time to completion. So you're going to always be trying to replace that student, right? When you think about an enrollment management, but they're going to come in saying, I already have these credits. How do they articulate to the degree? So articulation agreements are going to always become really central for how you're building or thinking about that student coming through the door. So to summarize, because I know, Cheri, you thought, what does this mean? Matt, you thought, what does this mean for us? Implications for all students, holistic supports for all students are always going to be essential in terms of the way we think about traditional or adult students. When we think about adult learners, thinking about childcare, caring for adults, transportation for all students, mental health needs is going to be something that we need to be thinking about. Wraparound services for all students. And then in terms of technology and data support to enable a personalized advising and outreach support for all students. So that's kind of like my big picture in terms of what does this mean when we think about the demographic.
I want to jump in on the adult learner piece. A lot of times advisors think I shouldn't be the one to talk about a student's financial well-being or their personal well-being. And that's not going to be an option in the future because especially as we have limited resources to staff tons of positions to wrap around a student holistically around all these different dimensions. As an advisor, you have to check in on certain things like how's it going academically? How is the balance of life with academics going? Finances, unexpected challenges coming up in that person's situation.
Right.
So it's going to force advisors to be more holistic than they may have originally felt comfortable doing so. Like looking back on my career in advising, I was always really hesitant to talk about finances with a student. But eventually I learned enough to say, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, and I'm not going to lead you astray in those conversations, but I'm going to get you connected to a person that I trust, I value, I respect, that will give you that information you need. And that referral process still needs you to know certain things. Because if you just say, that's not my area, go talk to financial aid, your student's not going to go talk to financial aid. They're going to feel like you just kicked them out the door and didn't want to have a conversation. So you have to structure it in a way of like, here is what I know. Here's what I don't know. And this is why I cannot be the one to answer those questions. And here's why I want to get you connected to this person. So you're going to have those conversations, especially with adult learners, because the things driving their persistence to a degree isn't around institutional satisfaction, not as much as a traditional aid-to-call student is. It's around their finances, their personal well-being, the balance of multiple competing priorities, and then how they're overall performing academically and either thriving or struggling in their coursework.
Right. And then their ultimate career goals. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, the irony of it is we're saying you must be more holistic, which means you have to have more time with your student. And then we're simultaneously seeing advisors now saying caseloads are increasing on their point. So I'm having conversations with people with 1,000 or 1,500 students. So instead of punting it back to the advisor to say, well, what are you going to do to figure that out and balance your caseload? I actually challenge institutional administrators to go through the question of what got you to this problem in the first place? And is your institution actually committed to academic advising like it says it is? Because if it is committed, they wouldn't have let this problem come up. Yes, there are funding constraints. But I think now more than ever, academic advising is going to be one of the most important, valuable resources and structures and services on campus that every student's going to need. Because who better to help a student think through navigating the complexity of higher education and access to the workforce than an advisor who day in and day out is helping them build that navigational capital.
And, Kyle, you're mentioning budget, being more holistic. And I've heard it even in this office where, we've said, wow, I think students are coming to us more and more and wanting more answers for things that we may not have as much information on, but we're getting that information because while we have the student, we don't want to lose them. We want to be able to give them all the information that they need, build that connection, but still have handoffs to wherever they need to go. And I think this could be a good segue into this question for you, Kyle, is, you had also mentioned that there's a definition of advising that's coming up. Do you think that will maybe help institutions understand better the importance of advising and academic advisors that can maybe help with having advisors be more holistic and given more time with their students, impact caseloads, that sort of thing?
I mean, I sure hope so. It just depends on if they're going to listen, right? Because the draft that we have right now that's out with our membership for people to engage with and complete a survey on and give feedback on, not only espouses what advisors do every day and what their scope of practice is, but what institutions are now responsible for to allow for advising to be successful. So things in there include making sure that there are places and spaces for private conversations to preserve confidentiality. If your institution's listening to that, that's going to change up where advisors are located and placed to have those conversations. And then it also says in there that the individual interaction between an advisor and a student is the most critical piece of advising. Group advising can be a complement, but cannot be a replacement for those individual interactions. If your institution's listening, that's going to change up a lot of practices and hopefully put in more resources and invest. And it's not that I'm not saying that institutions are not going to listen to it. I think that institutional administrators just want those answers and to be told. Because time and time again, when I've met with institutional administrators that don't have a background in advising, they look at me and say, okay, what is advising? What does it do? And how can I make it better in my institution? So they care. They just need answers. And for a while, NACADA was kind of shy to give those answers because the first thing we would say is, well, there's so many contextual factors to your institution, to your students. But I've seen common threads across these institutions of what advisors should be doing and can be doing for their students. And it's time we start pulling on those threads, which is why I'm excited for this definition, because it will give answers to people that have been asking for these answers for a very long time. We get lots of phone calls and emails about, does NACADA have a formal definition of advising, or do we have to come up with it ourselves? Now, I also know that the other question is caseloads. We're getting to it, but let's start with defining the profession first.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting to hear, Kyle, because when you say that you're a profession, there's definitions that gives the institution an opportunity to operationalize. And I love your point about if somebody is unfamiliar and says, give me the knowledge to be able to make the case then you can say here, right, is how we define ourselves and not let somebody else define you. So that's exciting. That's exciting.
I'm so excited for this new era as we're approaching the 50th year. It's just wonderful to think that there's actually going to be a definition that folks can use across the board to talk about academic advising. Kind of changing gears a little bit, but in light of, the massive caseloads you're talking about, wellness has always been a passion of mine. And especially for academic advisors, I spent almost 20 years, like Melinda, I started when I was 10, but I spent so much time as an academic advisor. And I found folks in this profession give so much, and it's often at the expense of their own well-being. Mm-hmm. And lately, we've been seeing, what's been called the great stay, right? Advisors are kind of staying in their roles, but they're not always engaged and thriving. So I'm curious, how do you think advising offices can move beyond retention of staff to really focus on re-engagement, purpose, and really meaning in the work? And I think, the definition is a great start, but I'm curious if there's other strategies you folks have seen or heard of.
I mean, I hate to start out with this, but I have to be really honest about it. The first thing is you got to pay your people. Like basic needs, first and foremost, if you want people to be thriving and well, is they have to earn enough to live. And that's not always the case that we're seeing. I have heard from advisors who are still making under $40,000 a year in some parts of this country. And that means that they have to find roommates for their living situation if they're single. And I'm like, oh, that shouldn't be the case, right? And then the part that higher education is saying there is value, there is return on investment. And yet when I do a quick Google search on like what's the average earnings of an employee with a high school diploma, they're north of $60,000 is what AI is telling me. Whether that's 100% accurate or not remains to be seen. But that's my quick search is average earnings is 60,000. And then we're saying for this profession where many people are posting positions that are master's required or master's preferred, we're going to pay you under 40,000. It's the own irony that higher education is saying there is return on investment, but not for our own people, right? And so you have to compensate your people appropriately for them to be able to live and thrive personally. I would be remiss if I didn't say that explicitly. So if there are institutions that are still undercompensating people significantly, that's problem one. And that's why you're probably not going to get a whole lot of incentivization for people to engage. They're showing up to show up for exactly how much you have demonstrated value in them in that case. Now, for the folks that are like, well, we're paying them, but we also have incredibly high caseloads and there's nothing we can do about that right now. The whole institution has to come together and define what are the goals for advising at that point in time. Is that you must see all of these students in your caseload. Well, that's going to turn advising into transactional conversations. It's going to make advising very limited and 5 to 10 minute conversations where you cannot provide holistic support. So then the institution has to come back and say the goal, therefore, is to target X, Y, and Z groups to have the most benefit from academic advising at that point. That right there will ultimately help advisors feel like where is their utility, where is their value, where is their purpose, rather than being this churning machine of 5-minute conversations. So for the institutions that have defined that and said, yes, we want you to stay in touch with this pool of students, but these are the ones that we really need advising to invest in and double down on. They're finding more well-being because they're saying, cool, I can still have my balanced schedule, 30, 45-minute appointments, and invest in the students that you're telling me to invest in. So I think that's the next thing that can help with overall preserving well-being. And then the third thing is acknowledging that if you are in those unrealistic capacities, then the institution also has to acknowledge that it's okay for an advisor not to be able to be responsive within several hours, one day. There's just some realities that have to happen at that point. And if the institution's not acknowledging those realities, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So it's acknowledging that we don't expect you to be able to do all of the things in your job description every day. So here's where your priorities are. Helps then the advisor feel like they can put boundaries around their day-to-day.
Yeah.
Those are my things that I'm talking about. Like otherwise, thinking through things like wellness spaces is great, but if they don't have the time to go use those spaces, if we offered you this, so you just don't have the time to go use it. Melinda, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. For me, what I was hearing is, number one, is it a process issue? Is it a systems issue? Is it a practice issue in terms of what is driving the burnout? When we try to examine caseload dynamics, what is it that is required of your advisors in terms of what it is that they need to do to be able to support students? I think when I was advising and then became an advising administrator, it is hard because this is not just a caseload. These are people. These are students. And so you get caught up in their lives. You want to see them be successful. And so it is really hard not to want to respond to that email or to follow up with that student or to see what's going on. And so I think that that's also part of the tension, right? These are not just widgets. You know what I mean? Like, people are crying out, especially post-pandemic. You were really kind of connected to people's lives in terms of what they were doing, right? Especially when people were really sick and they were losing people. There's a book that I'm going to read because the cobbler kids have no shoes. I struggle with rest. I struggle with burnout myself. So I'm just, disclosure, just being honest. Rest is Sacred by Octavia Rahim. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this text, but one of the questions in the book is presence is greater than perfection. And I think sometimes with burnout, we want to do everything for everybody. And so, Kyle, I love your point earlier where it's like, maybe I can't do everything for everybody all at once. And so I think sometimes when we are asking ourselves about burnout, is it because we're trying to triage everybody and give them everything that they need? And maybe sometimes you can't. And so when we start thinking about how do we manage caseloads with limited resources, I know that I struggled as an advisor with like the idea of perfectionism. Like, I just wanted to give everybody everything because I deserved that they needed it. And if I was this student, I would want somebody to, you know what I mean? And sometimes we just can't do that. And so I think when your institution says, I can't, and I love the pushback you give, Kyle, well, why did you end up here? Is it a resource issue, or is it you not understanding what the design of what people need to be doing in order to be able to support students? If you say you care about retention and persistence, then you got to put your money where your mouth is, right? If you say that you do and you see that you're losing students, then what is the remedy? What is the solution? So, I mean, I could go on all day with this because I had this hat and was like, if you really care, then it's not just about giving me more advisors. It's about changing systems. And it's also about feeding into your people and letting them understand, how do I better support and serve? And it's about fueling us. And so when I think about how we continue to rejuvenate ourselves in this work, because it is heavy work, you're carrying people's lives in your hearts and in your mind, and you're taking it home with you at night. And I think I am thinking specifically, not just pre, but also post-pandemic, it got really heavy for a while. I brought a lot of that home. And so when I think about sustainable career paths, the people who are doing the work are also the best people to figure out the solutions. And if you're not inviting them to the table and say, well, what do you guys think? And you're just trying to figure it out and then giving us a solution, my God, you know what I mean? You're talking sometimes to the wrong people. And so everybody should be at the table when you're thinking of a solution. So if you're talking with solutions and you're not inviting advisors to the table, just know that you probably don't have the right people at the table. That is my call out to advisors. Talk to an advisor if you're creating solutions for advisors. If you're creating solutions for students, you should have students at the table. You're going to get there faster.
No, I think, exactly the reasons Melinda mentioned, and Kyle also. I think it's just so important that we're asking our advisors, what do you need? Same with your point about students, that community voice, that student voice is so important. There's so many people in positions of power who are making decisions, for communities they're not talking to. And I think just it's so simple to ask on a human level, how are you today? What do you need? And so thank you so much, both of you, for raising that. And Kyle, especially the compensation point. It's a big one. I have another question. Just thinking about, creating sustainable career paths. We have so many academic advisors who are doing amazing work, and we want them to stay in this profession. What role can professional development, mentorship, community building play in ensuring that advisors don't just survive, but that they're thriving long term? And some of these were mentioned, but curious if there's anything else you'd like to add.
I can start because the last part about mentorship is really important. Because Kyle, I don't know which direction you're going to go in. I think sometimes people beg their institutions too much to give them things that they really can't produce, right? Sometimes you'll say, I should be promoted because look how long I've been loyal to you. And I'm like, you know what? You need to leave. You need to leave because sometimes structures don't allow for what it is that you really need to, what you have been designed or what you could really do. And so sometimes there's frustration and resentment, but I know sometimes people are landlocked, right? And so there are other ways that you could continue to develop and grow, but maybe it's not in your title. And so mentorship is, I think, and for me, I have benefited in an amazing way to either present, to write, to do keynotes where that my growth continued to develop maybe in this. Well, you guys can't. Well, if you're listening, I am going outward, right? Even if I can't go vertical, you know what I mean? In terms of my development, to continue to grow my capacity to do great work in this field. Because sometimes my structure within my job wouldn't allow me, right, to maybe grow into a position. So mentorship is very helpful for us to be able to see outside ourselves. I think sometimes I've heard a lot of people that I've mentored say they won't promote me, they don't see me. And I'm like, baby, that's because maybe you're supposed to not go through this door, but through a window. And then people leave their institution and they blow up. Because you were never meant to grow there, right? The seed was planted and then you were supposed to move in a different direction. But sometimes people spend years of frustrations saying, well, how come they didn't pick me? So sometimes I hope that if you're listening and you're wondering, when am I ever going to blow up here? Maybe you're not supposed to blow up there. But I do recognize that sometimes we are landlocked, meaning that we can't necessarily leave there. Maybe you're finishing your degree or maybe the school's paying for your degree. Like, I get that. That was me. Listen, I wasn't leaving my institution until, I crossed that stage. And so I recognized that I needed to bloom where I was planted. And so I was able to do that in different ways. And so that requires patience. So mentorship really helped me in that space. So that's what I would offer when we think about growth and development in career. Because soon as you're able to move, you will continue to bloom.
Your point on loyalty isn't always the thing that needs to be rewarded. Really resonated with me as well. Like I very much value when an advisor stays in an institution for 20, 25, 30 years. But that doesn't always necessarily mean that they've spent time intentionally refining and developing their skills. They might have been occupying the position and staying, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've been growing and improving. So I think that that's something that a person should always be thinking through is how can I refine my skills? What can I improve on? And what can I enrich my competencies around as an advisor? What student population can I learn more about more deeply? And that's where ProDev comes in and is huge because we've got free resources for our membership to access through our publications. If you pay for membership, then you can also access all of our online events hosted by advising communities and regions. There's over 100 of them in a given year. So some great resources where you don't have to have thousands of dollars to go seek out. You can actually get them for $95 for your general membership of NACADA or other publications and videos out in the universe. There's lots of different ways you can grow as a professional to challenge yourself to refine your skills around student population, or if you want to look more at like the project management side, great opportunities for you to take on a project and develop that skill. And so to Melinda's point, yeah, that patience is huge because sometimes that does mean you're taking on administrative work and not always necessarily being rewarded for it. But part of that comes down with future benefits of like, yes, I took on that project and now I'm a project management wizard. I wish I had those skills. And that's going to take you maybe in a different direction, but still serving students and their success And I think we need to look at the career trajectory of these professionals as, are you still contributing to student success in your overall career lifespan rather than narrowed down into academic advising specifically? There's lots of different growth trajectories for a person when you broaden those horizons a bit. Now, granted, we also want them to stay in the profession, right? But that's not always options available to them. Maybe there's no career ladder in place or a structure to recognize skill development and growth. In that case, maybe there's other roles that still serve students and their success that a person can seek, find that fulfillment while being able to advance in their career.
Right. No, I agree, Kyle. The one thing I will add too, because sometimes I get asked this question when I'm mentoring others about supervision, like how do I get supervision if I don't have a direct report, or like when do I, because in order to sometimes move into management, people are looking for like, well, who would you supervise? And I always say, is there an opportunity to supervise an intern? Is there an opportunity for you to think about how those skills are transferable? And so for your project management piece is actually a really great idea. Like, have you pulled a team together? Have you been able to demonstrate your ability to move something forward, but then maybe you bring like a cross team effort together and you're able to show how you kind of pseudo supervise others when you're kind of leading through a group. So that's a really great point that I just wanted to illustrate when people ask me like, I've never supervised, then how do I become a manager, and showing that I can supervise if they never let me give a chance to supervise. So those are just some things that I kind of recommend to others who are looking to kind of get into supervision, because that's definitely one way to move up in your roles, right? When you think about advising levels 1, 2, and 3, how do I ever move up? Because the next step is supervision.
Gosh, I feel like we could have a whole hour just talking about this particular topic. Now we have about 10 minutes left. I know Sharon and I have a couple more topics we want to get through. So the one I'm going to go with, and I'm probably going to combine my question into one with multiple parts, A, B, and C, is emerging technologies and next-gen students. So much great advice you both have already given. And so let's talk about like emerging technologies. You can't seem to turn a corner or look through an email or read an article without seeing something related to technology, especially with AI. And I know with, higher ed professionals probably have come to the both of you going like, Kyle, Melinda, how do we navigate the rise of AI? How do we use this in academic advising? The next generation of students that are coming up, this is probably all they're going to know. How am I supposed to be prepared? How do you help unpack all of that for someone? So I'm going to throw it to Kyle first and then to Melinda.
Yeah, it's a lot, but I always remind people that they've had to adapt to technology in the past 50 years. Constantly. People freaked out in higher education with the rise of internet. Internet's going to cause plagiarism. Internet's going to cause me to lose my job. Internet's going to disrupt the student learning experience. And the wheel turns and history repeats itself. AI comes out. AI is going to drive plagiarism. AI is going to limit the student experience. AI is going to take away my job. But if you look at how history has worked, yes, it changes the landscape, but it doesn't remove you from the landscape if you're willing to grow and adapt. So people had to think through, how do we embrace internet? I still remember having my folders and files in 2012. And it was like, hey, do we want to move to a digital filing system for advising files? And people were like, are you out of your mind? And I was like, well, no, because the internet's been around for a while and there should be these solutions at this point. So I think that's the other thing people remind themselves of is these things take time. Yes, there's a lot of interest in AI right now, but and people are really trying to embrace it quickly, but there are still so many flaws to AI that have to be worked through before people can even remotely consider the possibility of a full-fledged AI advisor. AI is going to never not hallucinate. And so if you're hallucinating student files, student situations, degree requirements, that's bad, right? So there's always going to need to be that fact-checking process, and there will always need to be that human connection to the institution. Like I said earlier, sometimes that's the advisor is the only source of connection for a student to an institution. So I do think that AI has the opportunity to take away things that we don't necessarily like about our day-to-day jobs. Like one thing I started using more earlier on, which was also when AI was starting to emerge, you just didn't hear it as much, was when you had auto writing functions in your email. And suddenly it was catching things and common mistakes I was making in my email, but it was also predicting what I was saying based on who I am as a person. That's AI. So we've already been introduced to this for a while now, with co-pilots in your inbox, with different rules it's building based on how you write and how you stylize your responses. So I think people just need to kind of get to the curious phase of it, really explore what are the things that it can take care of to make your life a little bit better, a little bit easier, but then be really careful about where is the line where it no longer serves you best or your institution best. So I know that there's a lot of enthusiasm for it because administrators and folks are looking for efficiencies. Advising is not going to be that thing that goes away and that the robots take over, but it will change the landscape of advising and what you do day to day. And I would just encourage people to start getting curious about it now, so that way when those changes do come down, you're ready for it. Like one thing I was grateful for in the pandemic was that NACADA already had Zoom, and me as a volunteer leader had access to Zoom for 3 or 4 years before the pandemic hit. And then all my colleagues were like, what's the Zoom thing? And I was like, my time has come. I know things. So that's where I'd say get curious, so that way you can be ready proactively.
No, I would agree. I had the wonderful opportunity to hear from Ethan Mullick from Stage, and he wrote the book Co-Intelligence. And so what he had, encouraged all of us to think about was how AI hadn't really been written yet. So Kyle, to your point, we have all been immersed in these technologies before. And it hasn't been written. So we should be playing around with it. And so on Stage, he went ahead and was just using ChatGPT, and he was going through all these prompts. And faculty were like, you know what I mean? While he was doing stuff in real time. And then the people who were like, I've engaged, yes, do more on Stage. And so we were all enthralled because it hasn't been defined yet in terms of what it is that we're experiencing. And so, Kyle, absolutely shout out to Grammarly. That has saved my life. Now, listen, when people are in school now doing their dissertations, I'm like, I sound old. I'm like, let me tell you about how I had to do my own transcriptions. Like, I sound like that now. You know what I mean? And so when I think about what it means for us, we have digital natives coming in. I'm telling my daughter, get off your phone and get on a computer. Like, I feel old, right? All the stuff that people can do with these emerging technologies. The Titan Partners just released a report, I think it was in August, that talked about the sense of belonging is what's driving retention and persistence for students and institutions. So, Kyle, absolutely. People still want that human connection. I feel like the way that AI is showing up for us in terms of practitioners and the work we're doing is our ability to be more efficient with administration. You know what I mean? Let me finish this email quickly. Let me manage my caseload notes, you know what I mean? So I can get home by 5:30. I think that is the way, I got to get this accreditation report done. I feel like that is how AI is emerging and helping us become more efficient. But when we think about who we're seeing and how this is going to be supporting from a curriculum perspective, in terms of how faculty are thinking about how it shows up in the classroom, being afraid of plagiarism. How do we not help students understand that you should be checking your sources, citing your sources? You know what I mean? Like, just from an academic perspective, we should be teaching students the best way to use these technologies in the classroom. So, if there are any faculty listening, play around with the technologies. Students are using and engaging these anyway. So why wouldn't we teach them how to use them responsibly? And then how do we think about what the resources or sources that are being pulled into these technologies? We would want to understand the background, right, in terms of how we're using these technologies. And so I think that we should be aware, right, of what it is that we're engaging with on a daily basis. Because you're right, Kyle, they're not going anywhere. And so I think that we should be adaptive. I think that we should be cautiously optimistic about how we could adapt these technologies to become more efficient with our administration and its use. when I hear from campuses about how they're using chat boxes, because earlier I said something bad about chat. I know people are rolling their eyes like, didn't you just say something about chat boxes? When I think about chat boxes, for the student who's up at night or for the adult learner, right, I'm working, I'm taking care of my family, I just have a question. I just want to know when you're open. I just want to know where does this policy lie on your website? They are actually using the data or harnessing the data to say, what are people wanting to know? What questions are they asking the most? It helps them shape how they're designing their website, what information to make sure that they're giving in orientation. So they're using this data to really inform their practices. And so that is important, right? So they're using these technologies to help form those practices in terms of how they're supporting students. And so it is important, right, how we think about how we're using these technologies. So chatbots, not bad, all the time.
My takeaway is that AI is not going to take jobs. It's folks who know how to properly use AI, I think, will be the ones who are taking jobs. And there's definitely ways we can use it appropriately. Kind of taking us into the home stretch, Kyle, as we're turning to the future of advising in NACADA's role, 2030 is not too far away. Right now, higher education is facing a lot of disruption, but also a lot of opportunity. In this moment, I'm curious how NACADA is evolving to help ensure advising is not just student support, but really seen as a driver of institutional transformation, and how we as members can help NACADA shape this future together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm personally really optimistic for the future of advising, especially given the current metrics that higher education is being held accountable to. Like I said earlier, who better than an advisor to help students navigate both the complexity of higher education and the transition to the workforce than an advisor who's day in and day out building navigational capital. What I do think needs to happen is that we need to get that message out to administrators, to folks who are a part of higher education, but may have antiquated perceptions of what advising is based on their time in college, based on their kids' time in college. So I think we need to give those answers to institutions that they are begging for, frankly, like the definition, like caseloads. But I think that those are our first step. From there, I think we start thinking through, okay, now that we know what the scope of practice is for an advisor, what ethical guidelines should they be held accountable to? What things can we ensure that every advisor is trained with from NACADA's perspective to make sure that they have the conceptual and the relational skills developed while an institution really trains them on the informational pieces of their competencies. And things like maybe one day NACADA has a professional certification for academic advising. There's pros and cons to that approach. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's the way to go. It's just something that I think we should entertain and think through and consider really meaningfully. Or a way for NACADA to recognize institutions who excel at advising. Some type of accreditation status or something to complement their regional accreditation to say, hey, NACADA has issued this gold standard for us and we met that benchmark, and that should help then inform their regional accreditation or professional accreditations. So I'd love to pursue those ultimate goals that I think are possible by 2030 to really solidify advising matters. Advising is a profession. Advising needs to be respected.
I'm curious, if you could challenge each NACADA member to take one action this year to move advising towards that 2030 goal, what would it be?
I would encourage every single person to talk to someone who doesn't know about advising in higher education and tell them what it is. And if we've got that definition, use that definition. But use whatever resource you have to really help start shaping the narrative around what is advising, because there's tons of perspectives around it that aren't always the best informed perspectives in higher education. So even if it's someone that you think knows what advising is, tell them anyway. So that way we're starting to get some common messages out and really raising the bar of what makes advising advising.
Awesome. That's the call. And I wish we had more time, but I know this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but such an important discussion that needs to happen. But Melinda, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for having us.
Thank you.